Welcome to today's podcast by Media News. My name is Desmond Fernandez, and I have great pleasure in welcoming Margaret Owen to the programme. So welcome, Margaret. Margaret is the Director of Widows for Peace Through Democracy, WPD. WPD works to make sure widows of all ages, irrespective of religion, class or nationality, are protected from discrimination and violence and can enjoy their full human rights. It prioritises widows in the world's most war-torn and poverty-stricken countries, helping widows' organisations in each country to fight for a better life for widows and their children. Margaret is also a patron of Peace in Kurdistan, a UK barrister and an international women's human rights activist. WPD has ECOSOC status at the United Nations, which focuses on the human rights of widows and wives of the disappeared. She's also a founder member of GAPS UK, that's Gender Action on Peace and Security, that addresses implementation of UNSCR 1325 and subsequent UNSCR gender-related issues in the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Margaret also works on a variety of challenges relating to the rights of minority groups. She received an OBE in 2013 for her contribution to the advancement of women's human rights and especially for pioneering work on widows' rights. Today's podcast focuses on the UK and Boris Johnson's government's questionable stances, which represent a breach with CEDAW, which is the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. As Margaret put it in a letter that was published in The Guardian this June, and I quote from it, Boris Johnson's government betrays not just children, but also women and girls, not just here, but across the world, by its brutal cuts in aid to the communities that need it most, and by its breach of legal obligations under CEDAW, the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Its arms sales and trade deals to racist, misogynist, and authoritarian regimes, whose wars create unaccounted millions of widows of all ages, violate the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. End quote. Now, that issue, which I've just mentioned there, will be the subject of a forthcoming podcast with Margaret, as it demands attention of its own. But here, specifically for the podcast today about CEDAW, over to you, Margaret, concerning, as you describe it, Boris Johnson's government's betrayal of not just children, but also women and girls. And also, what of the stance of the opposition parties and UK NGOs and a permanent People's Tribunal over this matter? Thank you once again for sharing your perspectives on this programme. Margaret?
Right, Desmond, what an introduction. Thank you very much. Maybe a bit over the top, because one is working so hard to stop violence against women, to eliminate discrimination against women. But as we all know, in the last few years, particularly in the context of the pandemic and the lockdowns, the violence against women and children has actually got far worse. I want to talk to you now about the UK government's appalling, not just indifference to the CEDAW, the UN Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Violence, of Discrimination Against Women, but its violation of all its articles. We're talking quite a lot these days. Many of us who are lawyers, often labelled by this present government as do-goody lefties, we're talking quite a lot about the UK government's breach of its international obligations, whether it's about the Refugee Convention or the way we halved our aid budget, what's happening in Northern Ireland. But the breach of our international obligations started dramatically over 20 years ago, when the coalition, the Tories with the Lib Dems, got rid of the UK Women's National Commission, the WNC. We have obligations under the CEDAW, and we have obligations which are not legal, but we agreed to them under the Beijing Platform for Action that was agreed at the Fourth World Conference of Women, along with all the member states of the UN, to have an institutional mechanism for women's rights. And that was when we had the Women's National Commission. But the Tories, or the coalition, got rid of it. And since then, we haven't got an institutional mechanism for women which is based on statutes. We've set up something much looser called a UK Women's Alliance, but it has no basis in legislation. And there have been numerous examples of violations of our obligation under the CEDAW, which have been taken up by the committee for the CEDAW each time the government reports on its track record in relation to the convention, because every 4 years governments must go to Geneva and be questioned about what they have done to comply. But we, the UK government, has been quite indifferent to the concluding remarks. For example, again and again, the UK government has been asked by the Committee for the Convention to domesticate the CEDAW. That is to say, to put all the articles in the Convention into our own domestic legislation. I mean, in some countries, Desmond, when a country ratifies an international treaty, it automatically becomes part of their national law. But in this country, that doesn't happen, and we have to legislate. But we've been told by the government that they have no intention of ever domesticating the CEDAW. They were also asked that the government should look at the impact of the austerity cuts on women and girls, because it was women and children, girls and boys, who actually bore the brunt of the impact of the austerity cuts. And we never did that. They were also asked to look at the impact of Brexit upon women and girls, and we never did that. And another example of our indifference to this UN convention, which was developed in 1979, the UK government ratified it in 1985, is that not once in over 42 years has this government ever nominated anyone from this country to even sit on that committee of 26 members. And therefore, there was such concern in this country, not just about the impact of government policies on women and girls in this country, but on the impact of our policies on women and girls all over the world. For example, the cutting of our aid budget from 7% to 5% will have extraordinary negative, irrevocable impacts on the lives of women and girls in some of the poorest countries in the world, where we used to lead about girls' education, about healthcare, about family planning. And so we decided that it was time to have a special permanent People's Tribunal, a PPT, a tribunal on the CEDAW, looking to see if we could gather the evidence in a permanent People's Tribunal, to gather the evidence that there were really serious and grave violations of our convention. So last June, by the way, maybe I should just say for people who don't know that the PPTs, the Permanent People's Tribunals, which were originally set up by Bertrand Russell, an extraordinary, really unique and valuable contribution to the human rights sort of architecture, because these people's tribunals can gather evidence from the voices that are so often not heard, voices from civil society, from the most vulnerable, for the most discriminated against. And they can gather evidence on a really quite a massive scale that conventional courts haven't got the capacity or the time to do it. And for example, just about a month ago, there was an amazing Permanent People's Tribunal on the Uyghurs, which was amazing. I mean, the evidence that they managed to get about what China was doing to the Uyghurs, with evidence from survivors as well as from researchers, incredible brave people who gave their evidence. And we've also had, of course, a Permanent People's Tribunal about the Kurds, and we've had one about child abuse. So it was important to have one about the CEDAW. The tragedy was, it was in June. It went on for 3 days in June. And there were probably about 40, something like 40 people giving testimonies to a body of judges who were giving their time pro bono, unpaid, to actually assess these testimonies. And I was the first person to open as a witness for the prosecution, being interrogated, cross-examined by one of the leading judges, who was Professor Christine Chinkin of LSE. And there were extraordinary testimonies given, particularly from migrant women, from LGBTB women, from refugee women, talking about what was happening in this country in terms of discrimination against women and girls. And then, unconscionably, unprecedentedly, the first time in my knowledge that a People's Tribunal has collapsed. The judges, it has to be, as it's a tribunal, at least 3. And there were 4 judges, and they all resigned. They resigned because the committee that set up this tribunal demanded that they give their, it was in June, that they give their verdict by August. They said they couldn't do it until October. They would do a summary one for them in August. And then the committees told them that their verdict would then go back to garden court chambers and be assessed again by some of the lawyers. Of course, this was absolutely, I mean, it was insulting to the judges. Well, when a judge gives a verdict, you don't expect it to go back to the lawyers for them to assess it. So the judges resigned. And there were about 8 of the maybe 40 testimonies. I was one of 8 people that supported the judges, were appalled by the way that they had been treated, understood why they had resigned. And we also wanted to know why this was happening. And we tried to get a joint Zoom meeting with the committee, and they refused. We had given permission for our evidence to be used for the purpose of the tribunal, but not for anything else. And I'm afraid they now have used our evidence. One of the judges who didn't resign, the Honourable Jocelyn Stutt, I think she did a loan report, but it wasn't a tribunal report because a tribunal has to have at least 3 judges. So they've used our evidence in a way that was not what we agreed to. And so, in a way, this CEDAW, this tribunal on the CEDAW has been a complete catastrophe and a fiasco. And yet all that evidence is very, very important. And we hope maybe that next year we can start afresh with a new lot of lawyers and maybe these judges will come back and help us again, because it's really, really important that we make our government accountable for their violations of this very, very important convention. I, as you said, Desmond, my particular niche on human rights is the one on widowhood. Widows are of all ages, and they are not just, their numbers are increasing unprecedentedly, not just anymore because of armed conflict, but now because of COVID-19. Because COVID-19 has become a massive widowmaker. More men are dying from COVID-19, from the pandemic, than there are women. And in many of the conflict-afflicted countries and the poorest of fragile countries, the poverty of these widows has reached even worse proportions, because under lockdown, the widows cannot even find work outside the home. I mean, often highly exploited work in domestic service, begging, even prostitution, agricultural labor. What is more, many widows' households in developing countries are dependent upon remittances, and these have all dried up because their relatives who had emigrated, their jobs have gone. So the poverty of these widows is extreme. We're hearing, for example, that in rural China, in remote parts of China, the elderly widows are so poor, they're actually committing suicide. And then you look at Afghanistan, what is happening in Afghanistan, particularly if you're a widow or if you belong to a minority like the Hazaris, then your life is intolerable, because you cannot even leave the house without a mahram, without a male guardian. They're completely dependent on outside help, and that's gone. There's no help for them at all. And our aid cut was also having a terrible impact, particularly on the lives of women and children. And we cut all our grant to UNFPA. We've cut our grant here to International Planned Parenthood Federation. I used to be, in my middle age, head of law and policy there. So this is a very, very challenging issue. And then I have to say that the Labour Party in its manifesto had said that it would reinstate or fill the gap left by the Women's National Commission, the WNC, and set something else up, although they've been extraordinarily silent about it in the last decades we've had of this Tory government. And many people in this country, many women in this country, don't even know about the existence of the CEDAW. They've never heard of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. They probably don't even know about the work of UN Women. And the Labour Party, I'm afraid, have lost, they've lost a huge opportunity to get the votes of women in this country. If only they would come out and attack the present government for its appalling way in which it is treating gender equality and women's empowerment. And all sorts of different areas and aspects of women's lives in this country. We've got more women in prison than any other country in Europe. We have masses of women in prison who should not be in prison. They're there because of huge discrimination against women in their lives, because of poverty, exploitation, maybe drugs, but they should not be in prison. And then the way we treat migrant women and refugee women and detain them as well is also a huge violation of our obligations under the CEDAW and under the Refugee Convention. So I'm finishing, Desmond, to tell you that when we speak to our own government about what are they doing and will they domesticate the CEDAW, the answer is from the Government Equality Office, well, no, we're not legislating, we're not domesticating the CEDAW. He said, because we don't find the articles legislable. And besides, he said, we've got the Human Rights Act. But the Human Rights Act, Desmond, does not cover, particularly, it's not focused on women and women's rights. And besides, we know that Boris Johnson, that his government, they're also maybe threatening the Human Rights Act itself, and we're worried that also they're going to take away judicial review. So we haven't really got much time. And I beg the Labour Party, the opposition, to actually prioritize women's rights and the importance of the CEDAW when, in order for this government to comply with its obligations. This is international law. And I finish by saying we're deeply upset about what happened with the tribunal, because it didn't happen. But I hope that next year we can start again with a fresh lot of lawyers and have the CEDAW, a tribunal on the CEDAW for this country. And I hope that it will work and it will be a model for other countries all over the world to have their own national people's tribunals on their state, on their position with the CEDAW, because many countries ratify this convention, but actually they don't comply with it. They often have reservations which are quite contrary to the very, not just the articles, but the very spirit of the convention. And maybe the convention, which was developed in 1979, maybe we need a new convention on violence against women, because violence against women is now on a, the types of violence against women have extended. We've now got a lot of violence against women, which is through the internet, on the cybernet. So I'm also part of a group that is looking at an Every Woman treaty, a new treaty about violence against women, which will look at all the different sorts of violence: psychological, sexual, internet violence, economic violence. And in this draft that we have now, which we hope the UN will look at and adopt, we do have special articles about violence against widows. Widows suffer in many countries. They suffer because of very discriminatory interpretations of religion, custom, and tradition. They're often subject to appalling mourning and burial rights. But they're outside the law. Whatever the constitution of their countries talks about equality, widows are often treated like chattels. When their husband dies, they could be inherited by their husband's brother or husband's cousin. They have no right to inherit. They can't inherit land. They are, every aspect of their lives is restricted, their mobility, their dress, their food. They're even subject to appalling torture, like ritual cleansing by sex, so that widows who are of all ages are the poorest of all women. And it's one of the driving forces for girls being taken out of school and put into early child marriage, because widows can't afford the opportunity costs of keeping their girls in school. So they take them out, marry them off to much older men, and these little girls become child widows. And I'd like everybody now who works on women's rights and children's rights to talk about, if they talk about forced child marriage, to give it its proper name. It's rape. If you marry a young child off to anybody, and often they're married off to men old enough to be their grandfathers, it is rape. So, Desmond, we have a lot to do. And in this country as well, as the testimonies to that tribunal that never actually happened, we heard stories about appalling discrimination of women happening in this country, where we have Sharia law and Sharia courts. And this is something that was uncovered in our testimonies. And it is really shameful that in this country also we have women suffering such extreme forms of discrimination. Thank you.
Well, really, thank you for highlighting those really, really shocking concerns there, Margaret. Just two interrelated questions come through, and I was just wondering if you could respond to them. As you say, the Labour Party has really just failed to highlight these issues, and I'm hoping that its members or key concerned committees within it can perhaps be shamed by its members if it's unwilling to respond to outside influences to address these really, really shocking concerns, which ostensibly at least the Labour Party claims to be concerned about. But the issue here is, if the Labour Party won't raise it, are there any all-party parliamentary groups willing to raise it with concerned MPs, from right across all the different parties? Because there must be some people really shocked by this, not just within Labour, but within the Conservative Party and the Lib Dems, the Greens and other groups. As you say, anyone who claims to be influenced by humanitarian values and just wide ethical values, or who claim to be concerned about women's and gender issues and concerns, well, this is such a central point or issue, and I don't know if you can respond to that. And the second thing would be, what about groups like Amnesty International or other UK-based NGOs? Have they raised issues of concern as to the context in which the PPT, the Permanent People's Tribunal, was just closed down that way? Because, as you say, there's just so much testimony, and for it to be closed down in those circumstances, it's really highly questionable. I mean, have women's groups raised their voices in protest at the way in which this whole thing just seems to have been made to collapse? As you say, it's unprecedented to refer the judges' final deliberations back to a group of lawyers to then decide whether it's appropriate or not. I don't know if you can just comment on those two things. And really, once again, thank you so much for such an articulate presentation of those really, really shocking issues, which really drive at the heart, as you say, of not just the current UK government, but previous governments. And it's just really shocking. But yes, if you can respond to that, and thank you so much once again.
Well, thank you very much, Desmond. Yes, I mean, there are lots of APPGs, associated parliamentary groups, that whether they're on women, peace and security, for example, or on conflict issues. We've got lots of support from lawyers, like, people like Helena Kennedy is really a huge on our side about violence against women, and of course we've just been hearing ever since the Sarah Everard murder
Yes.
and rape, how appalling both our police and even the Crown Prosecution Service has been. How in the Vera Baird, who's the victim commissioner, also talks about how few convictions there are for rape, and how women now don't even feel it's even worth reporting rape to the police, because their track record of actually following up is so bad. So yes, I mean, we do try with all these other committees. We work with the Fawcett Society, also has complained very vehemently on these things. So we have the Women's Equality, Caroline Oakes, who chairs the Women in Equality Committee. I mean, what is extraordinary, and I have to say this now, hope you're seeing it relevant, is that Liz Truss, who is now the Foreign Secretary, was previously the Minister for International Trade, but at the same time, she was also Minister for Women and Equality. And now, as Foreign Secretary, she also still is the Minister for Women and Equalities. But this was a most toxic combination of two portfolios, that whilst she was actually International Secretary for International Trade, she was signing massive trade deals with countries like Turkey, which has the highest femicide incidence in the world, that had 2 years ago came out of refused to sign up to the Istanbul Convention on Elimination of Violence Against Women, which is a misogynist and racist regime. And there she is as International Trade Secretary, and now she is Foreign Secretary, and again is absolutely impervious, it seems, to the fact that the countries that she wants to work with are often countries which are extremely misogynist as well as racist. I can't remember what your last question was.
It was really with regard to women's NGOs, other UK NGOs. Have they not complained about the way in which the tribunal has collapsed?
We were the women's NGOs. I mean, we were mainly NGOs, but also individuals who over 3 days in June gave extraordinary testimonies. And we are saying that we own these testimonies, and we did not agree that they should be used for anything other than for the tribunal. But what has happened without our permission is that the committee that was in charge of the tribunal have now went to number 10 and delivered a report which was written by this one judge who did not resign, the Honourable Jocelyn Scott, and they said that they were promoting a UK Women's Bill of Rights. But that is not what any of us NGOs asked for. We do not want a UK Women's Bill of Rights. We want our government to comply with the UN International Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is international law. We don't want something like that. So we are now, some of us are very, well, Desmond, we are pretty angry at the way we are being treated. And we're sort of, I suppose we're embattled in a way with the committee, and we are still arguing that we own the copyright of our own testimonies. And at least it's there. The incredible testimonies are there still to be used next year, when we can start again, take a breather, and get a proper People's Tribunal on the CEDAW on again. And I hope that we can somehow persuade the Labour Party. The Lib Dems have been much better. The Lib Dems have also said that they would fill the gap left by the Women's National Commission and set up another institutional mechanism for women. In a way, I think all the opposition parties, the Greens, the Lib Dems, and the Labour Party should all come together, because we are now being governed by people who are actually putting the clock back and taking away from us rights that we have by international law.
Well, thank you so much, Margaret. I'm sure the listeners, many listeners, will be just shocked by what they've heard, and rightfully so. And I hope it basically gets listeners to follow this up as well in an activist mode. Once again, thank you so much, and we really appreciate it.